Hello and welcome back. This is our fourth educational series on real estate, and I'm very excited to be with you all. Remember that everything in life is relative, and we often compare one thing with something else. Let's hope that when we compare one thing to another, that they're apples and not apples and oranges. Today we will examine some basic fundamental tools to help us evaluate our real estate investments. These are tools that afford us the ability to compare apples and are instrumental in helping us with our real estate investment decisions. I'm your host, Brian Shakarami, and let's get started. Please imagine this scenario. You are looking to invest in real estate, and you've searched everywhere and you have two buildings in mind, and you like both buildings, but you only have enough money to buy one of them, so you can only choose one of them. And you're not sure which one to pick or which one to go with. So the question is, which one is the better investment? So to help you choose, what criteria do you use to make that determination? I mean, after all, if you're doing an investment, then you can't just wing it and go based on your feelings. I mean, it's not like buying your residential home where you're more prone and prompted to buy based on feelings, perhaps because you love the kitchen or the color of the family room. So from a financial perspective, at a minimum, you should be looking at certain things. And this is where the net present value, abbreviated as NPV, and the internal rate of return, abbreviated as IRR, comes into play. So the question is, what is the NPV? What is the IRR? One thing for sure is they're both derived from the same place, and you need three things to find them. Number one, you will need the initial down payment or the purchase price if you are buying it cash. Number two, you will need the cash flows of the property, such as rental incomes. And finally, number three, you will need the sale price. So let's get started with the net present value, or NPV. The P in the NPV stands for the present, the net present value. And to determine this, we will need today's or the present values of our three items. If you think about it, both the sale and the cash flows happen in the future, so they must be discounted back to today's dollars. The down payment or the purchase price is already at today's dollars. We will use this convention going forward. Every time you make a payment, such as a purchase, it is an outflow of capital, and we will treat it as a negative value. And every time you receive payments, such as cash flows and payments due to a sale, it is an inflow of capital, and we will treat it as a positive value. And once we sum them up, we have our net present value. Moving on to the internal rate of return, or the IRR. The IRR measures the profitability of a potential investment. And for real estate, it measures the return on your investment while your money is sitting in that investment, being the property. And it can and is used as an interest rate that you can compare to the cost of your capital or funds, whether it's done through debt or equity, to finance an investment. Therefore, if the IRR on a considered investment exceeds the cost of capital, then it's a great investment. However, if the IRR on a considered investment is lower than the cost of capital, then it's not a good investment. So what do I mean by this? If the internal rate of return on your property is, let's say, 10%, but the banks and financial institutions only give you 6% on your investment, you have a great investment. However, if your rate of return on the property is 6%, but the banks or financial institutions give you a 10% return, then it's a poor investment. To calculate the internal rate of return, or the IRR, you must have a beginning and you must have an end. You don't necessarily need the cash flows in between, but if you have them, that's great. So at the end, once it's all said and done, at a minimum, you must have a purchase and you must have a sale. And you would hope that you have some cash flows in between. So here's a question that begs asking. What if you have a certain target yield in mind for your investment? For example, what if you say, if I purchase this property, I want at least a 10% return. This is your target yield. Then what price would you pay for a property to meet your target yield? To answer this question, you have to calculate your net present value using your target yield as your discount rate. This puts you in a position to evaluate things. And by evaluating things, I mean adjusting the purchase price. Because if your net present value is a negative number and therefore less than zero, then you must lower or reduce your purchase price by this negative amount if you want to achieve your desired target yield. If your net present value is zero, then you have achieved exactly your desired target yield and you're good to go. On the other hand, if your net present value is a positive number and therefore greater than zero, it signifies that you can afford to pay a higher price for the property and still make your desired yield. How much higher? By the positive net present value amount. So to reiterate, we will use the net present value and the internal rate of return to help us select the right investment. Therefore, here's what we will be covering here. Reducing the cash flows of alternative investments to their respective net present values for comparison purposes. Reducing these same cash flows to their respective internal rate of return for comparison purposes. Determining what alternative investments would meet a certain target yield. And finally, determining what price to pay to achieve a certain target yield. One thing is for sure, it is wrong to compare apples and oranges. We must compare apples and apples. To do this, we must reduce our investments to their respective cash flows. This is the only proper way to base your investment decisions on. And once this is done, meaning once we have our net present value and the internal rate of return, we're on our way to comparing things apples and apples. Let me inject a footnote here and say that the NPV and the IRR have some limitations. Limitations that we have to overcome, and we've already done this in one of the future segments called the capital accumulation. But for now, we're starting with the basics. And any sound analysis starts with cash flow because cash flow is king. In business, cash flow can make you or break you. So let's start with the king. To drive our points home, we will do 4 examples. And in order to make a logical financial decision, we'll compare our investments through their 1, the net present value, and 2, the internal rate of return. This will be the basis of our decision. We'll start with example 1, comparisons. Trump Enterprises is looking at 2 commercial properties with the intention of purchasing one of them. The acquisition price, projected sale price, and the projected net operating income of each respective property is depicted below. The property will be purchased in cash, so no financing is involved. Mr. Trump wants to compare these alternatives without regards to tax and depreciation. Which is the better alternative? Here, the cash flows are already pretty much given to us. Remember, any outflow of money is negative and any inflow of money is positive. The respective purchases of $5 million and $6.5 million are outflows of money, and therefore we will treat them as negatives. All the rents that we will collect are inflows of money, and therefore we will treat them as positives. And lastly, when we sell our property, we will receive some money and therefore an inflow, and therefore we will treat it as a positive number. And from here, it is easy to calculate our NPVs and the IRR for both properties. So which is the better investment, building 1 or building 2? Our conclusion is that investment one is the clear choice. Why? Because investment one has a lower initial investment, $5 million as opposed to $22 million. Investment one has a higher internal rate of return, 11.88% as opposed to 8.37%. And investment one has a lower holding time. You hold investment one or building one for 5 years, but investment two or building two for 8 years. Therefore, this was an easy judgment call. Moving on to example 2, target yield. Mr. Trump looked at the yields and blew his top. He said that the yields are not good enough for him. He wants at least a 12% yield. What should he pay for these properties to achieve his target yield of 12%? We will go back to our cash flow analysis and we will run this analysis based on a 12% discount rate to determine our respective net present values. Looking at the net present values for both properties, we see that they're both negative numbers. This means that in order to achieve Mr. Trump's desired yield of 12%, we must reduce their purchase price by their respective net present values. Reducing our purchase prices by their respective net present values, we see that for investment one, we should pay no more than $4,976,450. And for investment two, we should not pay more than $17,693,859. Moving on to example 3, which involves target yield and purchase price correction. Trump Enterprises is looking at 2 commercial parcels of land with the intention of purchasing one of them. The acquisition price, projected sale price, along with the annual taxes and carrying costs of each respective property is depicted below. The property will be purchased in cash, so no financing is involved. Mr. Trump wants to compare these alternatives without regards to tax and or depreciation. Which one should he purchase? Notice that the cash flows are negative. This means that the company is probably considering using the parcel for later construction or for itself somehow, and is not leasing the parcel. Otherwise, we would have had positive cash flows from the leases. And remember that the purchase price is also a negative number because it is an outflow. We have done our analysis and we have our respective net present values and our internal rate of returns. So now the question is, which property is the better investment, parcel 1 or parcel 2? Based on our analysis, we believe investment 1 to be our clear choice and therefore the winner. Investment 1 has a lower initial investment, higher yield, and lower holding period. Mr. Trump did not think that the yields on the 2 parcels of land were good enough for him. He wants to have an 8% yield. What should he pay for each parcel of land given this requirement? This is where we run our cash flow analysis for the 2 properties using an 8% discount rate to determine their respective net present values as follows. We see that they're both negative numbers, which means that in order to achieve our target yield of 8%, we must reduce the purchase price by the net present value calculated here. And once that is done, in order for us to achieve an 8% yield, for parcel 1, we can afford to pay no more than $4,921,706. And for parcel 2, we should not pay more than $5,723,070. Not if we want to achieve an 8% yield. Let's do another example on purchase price at a target yield. John Rockefeller is considering a real estate investment with the following cash flows. Mr. Rockefeller has a target yield requirement of 10%. Would this investment meet his objective? If not, what price would meet his financial objective? Easy enough. We run our cash flow analysis based on a 10% discount rate to determine our net present value under our required yield. We see that our net present value is a negative number, which means that we have to reduce the purchase price by this net present value amount. Therefore, if Mr. Rockefeller is to achieve his financial objective of a 10% yield, he cannot afford to pay any more than $24,219,300 for this property. To recap, we just covered reducing the cash flows of alternative investments to their respective net present values for comparison purposes. We also covered reducing the same cash flows to their respective internal rates of return for comparison purposes. We covered determining whether an alternative investment would meet a certain target yield. And we covered determining what price to pay to achieve a certain target yield. As always, if you have any questions regarding what we just discussed, please send me an email to the following link, and I would be happy to get back to you. Thank you for your time.